So I've started rewiring the keyboard. I think this is about the third time I've done this, but I'm sort of making this up as I go along and figuring out the best way to do it. So the problem I had last time I wired it up is there was no strain relief on the wires, and so with all the fiddling to get the 52 wires up through the base of the keyboard, or the top of the keyboard rather, I found some of the connections got a bit brittle, and one of them actually broke when I'd got most of the way assembling the keyboard. And so what I've had to do is come up with a way of providing strain relief for the wires so the soldered connections aren't under any stress when everything's being assembled and when the machine's in use. And the answer turned out to be quite simple actually. So all I've done is solder the wires on and then actually poked them through the mounting holes in the micro switches, which I'm not using. And the two wires only just fit through the hole, so they're a nice tight fit, which means there's no strain now on these soldered joints. So I'll go ahead, I've done one row of the keyboard here, I'll do the other couple of rows and then I'll start assembling it. So I've finished soldering all the wires onto the micro switches, and if it's in focus, you can see how the wires actually poke through the side of the switch, so that when I'm fiddling around trying to get the top on, that provides strain relief, so there won't be any strain on the soldered connections. You can see how this is quite fiddly because there's just a lot of wires and they all get in the way, of course. So what I need to do next is assemble all of the key shafts, and of course these go in here, so I need to carefully put all these in, moving the wires out of the way, and then each pair of wires coming off the switch gets poked through its matching hole in this top plate. These fingers push down on top of the micro switches and hold everything in place. So this will go on top like that. All the wires will come out of these little holes, and then I've got this other plate I printed up which has the channels that the wires will run in. So the wires will come through this and then they can lay down neatly in these little trenches, and that should keep everything neat and tidy. And it means all the wires are coming out the back here in one direction, and when the top of the keyboard goes on, it means that the wires will have a little bit of strain relief. Just noticed a bit of missing plastic there. The other good thing about this is with this plate on here, it means when I assemble everything, because the holes in this plate are the same size as the key shafts, all the key shafts are aligned, so it means putting the top piece on, which is quite thick, is a lot easier. So I'll go ahead and put all the shafts in and we'll have another look at it. I'm just preparing all the key shafts, and one of the things I'm doing is putting a little piece of Kapton tape over the ends, just to pad them out a little bit so that when I push them through the mechanism I can fit the little rubber bushes on the end to help pull them down, and so that when I fit the little feet that go on the end, they're a nice tight fit. Now this is where having one of these cutting mats comes in handy, because if you've watched enough of these films you'll have realized I'm a little bit of a perfectionist and I like everything to be neat and tidy and all the same. So with a cutting mat like this, it's got little marks on it, so you can lay the tape out and use a scalpel and cut little pieces of tape and get them all the same size. I just find that's a lot neater, and I've sort of found in the past that when you're making things, either electronics things or even software, the sort of people who are pedantic like this and you know, who take care in even just little things like this, build better things. I've noticed people who are messy or who don't pay attention to little details like this are usually bad at what they're doing. Same electronics or software, I've noticed the same thing. So it's like an indication of quality, I find. And I'm a bit biased because my job is in testing and quality in terms of software. But yeah, I've always found if something is assembled nicely and everything looks nice and has obviously been assembled with care, it's more likely to actually work properly. Like I say, that applies to software and hardware and mechanical things. Just one of those sort of observations you make in life. This just shows why the wires need really good strain relief. Because you can see to get my keys down into the little holes and around the micro switches and things, you have to deal with all the wires that are already in the way. And so it takes a bit of careful arranging of the wires, sort of getting them in out of the way like this, so that nothing gets pinched or nothing gets trapped when you're trying to assemble all the keycams, and then also get the top on the thing. So this is why when I had it wired up before with no strain relief on the wires, they started breaking. They started getting brittle. So I'll go ahead and keep doing that and get the rest of these keys in, and we'll have another look. I have all the key shafts in place now, and what I'm going to do before I start putting the top plates on is use my multimeter to actually buzz through and check that all the switches and all the connections are still working. So the way this works, the way it's wired up, I don't know if we can see it. Each switch is basically wired up like that, and the common isn't the common on the switch as you'd expect. So the common goes to the normally open connection on all the switches, and this common bus is wired to one end of the power supply. And the way it works is normally these switches, when they're not pressed, these two wires are connected together, and so the black wire will, all the black wires will go off to the entry wheel via the plug board, and all the red wires going to go to the matching letter on the lamp board. So normally these two are connected together. What happens when you press the switch is this red wire gets disconnected and the black wire gets connected up to the common. So when I test the switches, I have to test both positions, obviously. So I'll go through and do that now and just make sure everything's still working. These little micro switches have been soldered and desoldered several times now, so I just want to make sure there's been no damage to them. They should be fine. I use a very hot soldering iron, so I prefer to use an extremely hot tip and just solder very quickly, and I find that means you get less heat soak into components like this. I just find that a lot easier to do. So I'll go through and buzz all those out, make sure they work, and then start assembling the top. So now you can see I've got the wires threaded through that top plate. Because I've been going through and testing them all the ends of the wires are stripped, so it actually helps to twist the ends of the pair of wires together, and then you can poke them through the holes. So the issue now is this has to be dropped down on top of all of that by slowly lowering it down while simultaneously pulling all these wires taut and making sure that they just go straight up through the holes and don't end up wrapped around the key shafts like this one is. So it's a little bit fiddly. You sort of have to lower it bit by bit, but slowly you can lower that top down and just check that all the wires come straight up through the holes. So this just shows what has to be avoided. You can see there are some black wires there that are wrapping around the key shafts instead of going straight up. So what I have to do is loop them over the top of the shafts and make sure they pull straight up and through the keyboard. So now I'm at this stage where the top plate is all the way down. One of the problems is the bottom of the keyboard isn't supported, so it's actually bending in the middle, and I can't sit it on the base here because the little rubber pieces I've got to stop the keys popping up get in the way. They won't fit in here. So you have to be a little bit careful at this stage because everything's a bit wobbly until it all gets screwed together. But I think now I have all the wires in the correct position. You can see how it comes through the switch and then just goes straight up through the hole. The tricky bit is making sure that that middle row, none of the wires are pinched. Obviously the front row and the back row you can see, but the middle one is a little bit tricky to see, so you have to be quite careful there. What I'm going to do next is put on this plate, and so this is just a matter of threading the wires through and then pushing this down on top, and then I can lay all the wires neatly in the little trenches there. So we're nearly there now. I have the wires poked through the top plate. It's now just a matter of doing the same as that middle plate, which is dropping this down on top of the wires, making sure nothing's pinched, and then pulling them all tight. It's now at the mostly assembled stage. So you can see I've got the top plates on, and I've got a couple of the screws in temporarily just to hold everything down, because what I'm going to do next is rebuzz out all the connections to make sure everything's still good, check that all the keys move up and down freely. I've just noticed that one isn't clicking. Here we go. So this one isn't actually engaging the switch for some reason, which is a little bit of a worry. There we go. I think it's just it looks like there may be a wire pinched in here. You can see that this isn't quite sitting flat, so there's probably a wire that isn't quite pulled all the way through. When everything's pulled through, that should sit flat, and then that key should work. So I'll go and buzz all these through and make sure I haven't lost any wires, and then go on to the next stage. Okay, the reason this key wasn't working properly is because I didn't have everything sitting on top of the base. And so what I've done is I've taken all the little rubber feet off and put the base on, and you can see how the base has these supports to sit underneath the plate with the keys on it. That's because otherwise the plastic is quite soft and bendy, of course. So without that there, everything can flex. So with that in place, none of this is flexing, so it isn't moving around as much, and so the keys actually work properly now. So I'll go through and finish buzzing them out, and then we'll put the top on. This is now at the stage where I've got all the wiring neatly tucked into the little trenches, and it's all just held down with little pieces of kept on tape at the moment. So the next thing to do, the final thing, is to put the top back on. So I have to remember to take the temporary screws out first, of course. Now I did find when I was buzzing it all through that there were two switches that weren't quite making contact correctly. One of them was on one of these end rows, and I was able to bend the contact a little bit. But one of them was on one of the middle rows of switches, and that was a bit fiddlier, but I was able to get in there and just bend the metal arm on the micro switch just slightly. Again, I think the main problem is that this is flexing. Without the big solid top on there, it moves a little bit. So I think once this is back in place, it'll make everything very rigid, and hopefully it should all still work. So everything's assembled now. I have the top screwed in place, I have all the keycaps on, I have the little feet under the bottom. I did have one piece break which was on the base. Part of this broke off, so these actually sit into little pockets, and it snapped off. So what I'm going to do is reprint the base, and I'll make these bosses thicker so that it can't happen. That all just sits on there. And I have had a problem with one of my keys, which you probably can't see, but the top came off and some of the paint came off from underneath the key, so it's looking a bit ragged. But other than that, it seems to be working pretty well. I've got one key hooked up to the multimeter at the moment. I'll go through and I will check all the rest of the wiring and make sure we still have all the keys working. And if that's the case, then what I need to do is tidy up the wiring out the back. So you can see how, because of my plate with the trench, all the wires actually come out in a reasonably neat fashion. So what I'll end up doing is I will bundle these all into a nice wiring loom, and there will be a plug on the end there. I think these are the connectors I'm going to use on the end to join the different bits of wiring up together. So there should be enough cable there for me to be able to neatly tie that all together.